While U.S. naval assets patrol the Strait of Hormuz and tanker insurance markets price and the risk of every maritime mile through the Gulf, Iran is loading oil onto trains, not tankers, not ghost fleet vessels sailing under flags of convenience. Trains, moving overland through a rail corridor that does not pass through a single choke point the U.S. Navy controls, does not touch a single sanctioned port, and does not require maritime insurance from a Western underwriter. Reports indicate Tehran is actively developing overland rail export routes to move Iranian crude to China, its largest and most strategically critical oil buyer, as a direct response to the maritime disruptions that have defined the current conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, which normally carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply, has been contested, mined, and selectively closed to Western-aligned shipping throughout this war. Rail exports are slower than supertankers. They carry a fraction of the volume per trip. Every analyst covering this story has noted those limitations, and most coverage stops there. What most coverage has not fully mapped is what this route represents if it expands, not just a backup for Iran, a structural redesign of how energy moves between Asia's two most sanctioned major economies, outside every choke point, every port inspection regime, and every Western financial system simultaneously. Every sanctions regime in the last 50 years was designed around ports, banks, and shipping lanes. Iran just started building a route that uses none of them. That is not an incremental adaptation. That is a structural bypass. To understand why an overland rail corridor from Iran to China matters strategically, you need to understand how sanctions pressure actually works. Modern sanctions regimes targeting oil exports function through a specific chain of pressure points, maritime choke points where tankers can be tracked and insured only through Western-dominated financial systems where dollar dominance makes transactions surveillable and interruptible, and port infrastructure visible to satellite imagery and dependent on internationally recognized shipping documentation. Iran's oil export under maximum pressure has survived through evasion, ship-to-ship transfers, flag of convenience vessels, Chinese import infrastructure that doesn't scrutinize origin documentation, and the JASC terminal that bypasses Hormuz for outbound shipments. These methods work. They are also inherently fragile. Each one depends on maintaining the invisibility of individual transactions. A rail corridor operates on different principles. It is land-based, making naval interdiction irrelevant. It passes through sovereign territory of countries not party to Western sanctions regimes. It does not require Western port state inspections, Western maritime insurance, or dollar-denominated transactions if CIPS and local currency settlement are used end-to-end. Here is the foreshadowing the entire story depends on. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a network, and it took centuries to build, but reshaped the global economy for a millennium. The rail corridor Iran is developing is the first segment of what could become a sanctions-resistant energy supply chain connecting two of the world's largest oil producers and consumers across Eurasia. The first train matters less than what the track represents. Everything you just learned about how sanctions pressure works is about to matter differently, because rail doesn't just bypass one pressure point, it bypasses the entire architecture simultaneously. The conflict at the center of this story is not between Iran and the United States. It is between two competing models of how global trade is organized. The traditional model assumes global trade routes are maritime, that maritime routes pass through controllable choke points, that financial transactions flow through dollar-denominated systems, and that port infrastructure is visible and inspectable. That model gave Washington extraordinary leverage over the global economy. Iran's rail corridor development directly challenges the first assumption in that chain. A rail route from Iran to China does not solve the Hormuz problem for global oil markets. It solves it for Iran's bilateral oil trade with China specifically, which is the trade that matters most for Tehran's revenue survival. Iran currently sells approximately 1.22 million barrels per day to China, down from pre-war levels of 2.16 million barrels per day. Keeping that bilateral trade alive through any available route is Tehran's primary economic objective. The unexpected complication that most analysis misses, the rail corridor Iran is developing does not exist in isolation. China's Belt and Road Initiative has spent over a decade building rail infrastructure across Central Asia, through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and into Iran, specifically to connect Chinese markets with Middle Eastern and European supply chains. The infrastructure for an Iran-China overland energy corridor was not something Tehran had to build from scratch. In significant part, it already exists. Iran is plugging into a network that China built for precisely this kind of alternative routing. That context changes the strategic significance of the first train shipment entirely. It is not an experimental workaround. It is the activation of infrastructure that was designed to function independently of Western maritime and financial systems. Infrastructure that China has spent over $1 trillion building across Eurasia over the past decade. I need you to hold one number in your head for the next 2 minutes. China has spent over $1 trillion on Belt and Road infrastructure. That number is about to mean something different than it did before this conflict started. The Belt and Road Initiative was described by Western analysts primarily as an economic development program with geopolitical overtones. Almost everyone analyzed it as a peacetime economic instrument. The initial read of Iran's rail corridor development is logistical pragmatism, a sanctioned country finding a backup route during maritime disruption. But that framing evaluates the rail corridor as a volume solution. It is not primarily a volume solution. It is a proof-of-concept demonstration of sanctions-resistant trade infrastructure at scale, and the audience for that demonstration is not just Iran and China. It is every country that has watched the United States weaponize its control of maritime choke points, dollar-denominated financial systems, and port inspection regimes as economic coercion tools. The strategic significance of Iran shipping oil to China by rail is not measured in barrels per day. It is measured in the signal it sends to every economy in the global south that has watched U.S. sanctions pressure applied to Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and Myanmar simultaneously, and that has been quietly building its own contingency plans. Russia is already doing this. Russian oil flows east by pipeline and rail to China at volumes that would have been considered impossible before 2022. The infrastructure was built, the financial settlement systems were established. The political will on both sides was confirmed under maximum Western pressure. Russia's eastern pivot under sanctions is the case study that Iran's rail corridor is now replicating. The combined effect, Russia routing energy east, Iran routing energy east, both settling in yuan through SIPs, both using infrastructure built outside Western financial systems, is not two isolated workarounds. It is the early architecture of a parallel trade system specifically designed to be resistant to the pressure tools that Washington has used as its primary non-military foreign policy instrument for 3 decades. China did not build the Belt and Road to help countries evade U.S. sanctions, but in the current geopolitical environment, the infrastructure serves both purposes simultaneously, and the second purpose is becoming increasingly visible to every government that has reason to anticipate future U.S. sanctions pressure. Iran's first train to China is not a headline. It is a proof of concept with a global audience. The train is running, the route is proven. But there's one consequence of this development that goes beyond Iran, beyond China, and beyond this conflict, and it hasn't been named in any mainstream outlet yet. The Iran-China rail corridor, in its current form, is not a replacement for maritime oil trade. The volume limitations are real. But economic history is not made by the first version of a technology. It is made by the trajectory that the first version establishes. The first oil pipeline was not economically competitive with horse-drawn barrel transport. Within 2 decades, pipelines had reshaped the entire geography of oil trade. The Iran-China rail corridor establishes a different kind of trajectory. The proof that overland energy trade between Iran and China is physically possible, financially settlable outside Western systems, and operationally viable even under maximum maritime pressure. Once that proof exists, the investment case for expanding capacity changes. The marginal cost of adding capacity to an existing proven route is dramatically lower than establishing a new one. One thread this story cannot close: whether the rail corridor remains a conflict period emergency measure or becomes a permanent feature of Iran-China energy trade after the current conflict ends. That answer depends on decisions being made in Beijing and Tehran that are not yet public. The U.S. Navy patrols the Strait of Hormuz, the trains are running anyway, the choke point that was supposed to be the pressure that still exists, the route that makes it optional, that exists now too. The story of Iran shipping oil to China by rail is being covered as a logistics story. The actual story is about whether the pressure tools that have defined American foreign policy for 3 decades are becoming structurally less effective. Subscribe if you want coverage that tracks the long-term trajectory, not just the daily developments. Leave a comment. If overland rail corridors between sanctioned countries and China become reliable alternatives to maritime trade routes, does U.S. sanctions pressure become fundamentally less effective as a foreign policy tool? And what replaces it? One more thing. The Iran-China rail corridor uses the same Belt and Road infrastructure that China has been building toward Europe for a decade. If energy starts moving east on those rails, what moves west? That trade flow story, and what it means for European energy dependence on Chinese-controlled corridors, is the next piece.